One folded piece of paper. That was the only thing J.D. Vance brought to the table. Not a binder, not a stack of exhibits, not a team of researchers feeding him talking points through an earpiece. One piece of paper folded once, resting face down on his knee. He did not touch it for the first 40 minutes. He did not need to. The paper was doing its work simply by existing, by sitting there in plain sight while Adam Schiff talked and talked and talked about all the evidence he had seen. The event was called Restoring Public Trust, which in retrospect carried a particular irony. Dirksen G50 was filled beyond its seating capacity that evening. 3 broadcast networks running cables along the back wall, recording lights glowing red in the dim room. The organizers had placed these 2 men on the same panel, and rumors had circulated for days that the seating arrangement was not accidental. Whatever the intent, the result was this. The man who had spent 2 years telling the country he had seen the proof was now 4 feet away from a Marine who was going to ask him to show it. The audience that evening contained a specific kind of person whose presence mattered more than anyone noticed at the time. In the front row, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with glasses pushed up on his forehead had driven from Pennsylvania. His son had spent 18 months and most of a retirement account defending against an allegation built on claims that no one had ever been forced to substantiate in public. He had not driven to Pennsylvania to Pennsylvania. He had driven from Pennsylvania to Washington, not for partisan theater. He wanted to watch someone ask the obvious question. Just once. Out loud. On camera. He sat with his hands folded and waited. Schiff took the microphone first when the host invited opening remarks on the subject of trust and institutional credibility. He reached for it the way people reach for things they consider theirs, with the casual proprietary confidence of someone who has held the object so many times that the gesture has become unconscious. He said he wanted to be direct, since transparency was the evening's stated purpose. He looked at Vance and said he observed, in his counterpart on the panel, a man profoundly unfamiliar with how truth actually functions in American institutions. He said this with the careful deliberateness of someone who has workshopped the line. He described Vance's biography with the specific contempt that intellectuals reserve for credentials they find insufficient, the military service reduced to a public relations role, the memoir reduced to a commercial product, the Yale law degree characterized as something purchased with sympathy. He said Vance's supporters had been conditioned to mistake emotional resonance for factual accuracy, and that his own career, by contrast, had been built on the discipline of confirmation. He said, "My entire professional life has been defined by caution. I have built my legacy on speaking only to what I have personally verified." He reclined in his chair with the expression of someone who has just played an ace. He glanced at his watch. Vance did not react. He had been in environments considerably more hostile than a Washington panel discussion. He understood, in a way that only certain kinds of professional experience can teach, that the person who responds immediately to a provocation has already established the weaker position. He let the applause Schiff had anticipated arrive at roughly a quarter of its expected volume and then die in the air without finding purchase. Then he leaned forward and said, "I appreciate that, Senator. Genuinely. That may be the most useful thing you say all evening." He let the word useful sit there for a moment. He said, "You just made 2 very specific claims, and I want to hold both of them in the open, where everyone here can see them." What followed in the next several minutes was not an attack. It was something more precise, and therefore more devastating, a methodical verification process applied to a man who had just declared himself the standard bearer of methodical verification. Vance said he wanted to make sure he understood correctly, because the answer would determine everything that came after. He asked Schiff to confirm that when he said he only spoke to what he had personally verified, he meant that as a categorical claim, not a general aspiration, but a professional standard he had consistently maintained. Schiff confirmed it because he could not do otherwise without immediately contradicting himself. He added that precision of language was precisely the distinction between himself and individuals like Vance, who in his assessment had never been required to meet a rigorous evidentiary burden. Vance nodded slowly, the way a careful reader nods when a document confirms something they already suspected. He said, "I just want to make sure that position is clearly on the record, because I am going to need it in about 2 minutes." The room understood that something had just been constructed. Not dramatically, there was no orchestral swell, no visible reaction from Vance himself. Just a quiet, precise act of documentation performed in plain view of the audience. In March of 2017, Vance said, "You appeared on national broadcasts and told the American people that you possessed," and here he paused to indicate he was being precise, more than circumstantial evidence that the opposing political faction had engaged in active conspiracy with a foreign government. He said, not a suspicion that warranted investigation, not a serious allegation deserving scrutiny, more than circumstantial. You had seen it. He let that sit. Then he said, you continued making that claim in variations for the next 2 years. People who track these things have counted the public statements. The number they arrive at is over 200 times across television, radio, print interviews, and congressional proceedings. You told the American public that you had personally seen the evidence of an active conspiracy. The room was very quiet. He said, when the investigation that the entire country waited 2 years for was finally released, it confirmed foreign interference, it confirmed communications. What it did not confirm, could not substantiate after 2 years and the full resources of federal investigators was the central claim. The active conspiracy. The collusion you told 200 audiences you had personally witnessed. He looked at Schiff without any visible emotion. He said, I want to be straightforward about what I'm asking. I'm not asking for 200 pieces of evidence. I understand you may have been speaking in general terms on occasion. I'm asking for one. The single piece of evidence you personally saw that allowed you to tell the country more than 200 times that you had seen the proof. He put his hand on the folded paper, but did not pick it up. He said just one. The silence that followed was not the dramatic kind that exists only in retrospect after editing and score. It was the real kind, the kind that happens in a room where everyone present has simultaneously understood something, and no one is sure what the polite response to that understanding is. The first laugh was small and immediately suppressed, but it came from the center of the room, not the partisan edges, and that was the detail that would be analyzed afterward. What made the moment land with the specific force it did was not the content of the question. The content had been a matter of public record for years. What made it land was that the question was being asked by the person Schiff had just described as someone too unacquainted with evidentiary standards to understand how truth works in American institutions. He had established his credential. He had said, I only speak to what I've seen. He had said it while dismissing the man sitting 4 feet away as constitutionally incapable of grasping what that standard required. And then that man had asked him, with total calm, to demonstrate it. Once with one piece of evidence. Schiff did not reach for the moment of acknowledgement that a different kind of politician might have reached for. He did not say, that's a fair question, and here's what I was working from. He did not say, the intelligence I had access to suggested a level of coordination that the public report may not have fully captured, and in retrospect I overstated my certainty. Either of those responses would have been survivable. They would have been the kinds of admissions that allow a political figure to say, I was wrong, I've reflected on it, I've learned, and then move forward. He did not take that path. Instead, he pulled the microphone close and shifted into the register he defaulted to when the factual terrain became difficult. The prosecutorial moral mode, where the question becomes not what the evidence showed, but whether the questioner's motives were legitimate. He said, let me explain what is actually happening here. He directed his gaze past Vance and into the broadcast cameras, understanding correctly that the useful audience was not in the room. He said this was the oldest misdirection in political performance, finding a surrogate for an executive whose conduct he had been right to investigate, and having that surrogate challenge the investigator rather than the conduct. He said foreign interference was real. He said the communications were documented. He said he had executed his constitutional responsibilities while others lacked the courage to do so. He said he apologized to no one. It was a skilled performance. It had worked in many rooms before this one. It recovered the ground briefly. A journalist's pen moved, an aide in the third row who had been leaning forward with visible skepticism straightened slightly. The rhetorical momentum shifted back for approximately 20 seconds. Then a man at the far end of the panel slowly reached for his microphone. He was older, with the weathered hands of someone who had spent decades in physical work before the law. He introduced himself as a registered Democrat. He said he had voted consistently within his party for 30 years. He said he had no affection for the political figure Schiff kept referencing. He said, I will make one observation, and then I will go back to being quiet. He said that in 30 years as a federal prosecutor, he had worked in rooms where the professional standard was absolute. You did not tell 12 jurors you had seen the evidence unless you were prepared to put it in front of them. That was the whole profession. Not most of it, the whole thing. He said a professional could recover from being wrong. He said he had been wrong himself more than once. What a professional could not recover from, in his experience, was being wrong and then using the response window to characterize the people who believed you as naive for having trusted your own statements. He looked at Schiff directly. He said, a lot of citizens spent 2 years trusting your word. People in this country trusted that someone with your security clearance access would not say, "I have seen it on TV," unless they had actually seen it. When the document came out, the core allegation wasn't there. I understand that context is complicated. I understand the difference between intelligence assessment and prosecutorial standard. But what is not recoverable, for anyone in any room, is standing in front of the people who trusted you and telling them the problem was their credulity. He released the microphone. The room had changed in a way that was difficult to articulate but immediately palpable to everyone inside it. It was not that Schiff had lost the argument. Arguments in these settings rarely have clean losses. It was that the protective frame had been removed by a member of his own party. The frame that made his position legible as responsible oversight rather than overstatement had been taken away by someone who had spent his career inside the very institution whose standards Schiff invoked. The junior aide in the third row had stopped writing. She was looking at the older prosecutor with the expression of someone reconsidering a certainty she had held for a long time. Vance took a sip of water. He set the glass down with a small, deliberate sound. He waited 3 full seconds in the quiet before speaking. He said he wanted to make something clear for the record. He said he was not trying to end a legacy. He said he understood how pressure and media cycles created conditions where a public figure got ahead of the evidence. He said he had been in professional situations where he stated more confidence than the underlying facts supported. He offered this without performing humility. It read as genuinely incidental, a professional acknowledging a common experience. He said, "That is not what this is." He said, "What this is someone who maintained a specific claim, not for a news cycle, but for 2 years, and who at the moment when the authoritative record failed to support the claim, returned to the same cameras and said the evidence was visible to anyone paying attention in plain sight." He used that exact phrase. Plain sight. He said it in the weeks immediately after the investigation's conclusions became public. He looked at the folded paper but did not open it. He said, "There is a single moment available to a public figure who has overstated their certainty. A single window. You step into it. You acknowledge the gap between what you claimed and what the record showed. And the public extends the grace that they extend to people who demonstrate accountability. That window exists in American public life. It is real. People use it and they recover." He said, "You did not use it." He said, "Instead, in the same interview cycle where the investigation's limits became public, you told the country the issue was that ordinary citizens had become too accustomed to politicians withholding the truth. You said the public needed to learn to see what was in front of them. You said the evidence was in plain sight." He paused. He said, "You had 200 opportunities to say I have seen it. You had one opportunity to say I overstated my certainty. You chose to spend that opportunity telling the people who trusted your word that their failure to see what you saw was a deficiency of their attention." The sound the room made was not laughter. It was quieter and more final than that. The congressional censure vote was a matter of public record. Vance cited it not with the energy of someone landing a blow, but with the flatness of someone reading a document into the formal record. In 2023, the United States House of Representatives had voted 213 to 209 to censure Adam Schiff. The specific language used in that censure, the language voted on by his colleagues and entered permanently into the institutional record, included the word misled. Vance said, "That characterization did not come from me. It did not come from a partisan commentator or an opposition research file. It came from the body you have spent your career telling the public you were protecting. They evaluated the conduct and attached your name to that word in their permanent record." He said, "You referenced permanent records earlier. Your name appears in them twice now. Once for the unverified material you submitted, once for what your colleagues concluded about your relationship with the people you represented." If the previous exchanges had been devastating by the standards of formal panel discussion, what came next was of a different category entirely. Vance's voice did not change. His posture did not change. The folded paper was still on the table, still unread in its entirety, but what he said next moved the discussion from the specific matter of the Russia investigation into something that landed with the audience as a pattern rather than an incident. He referenced reporting available in public record, suggesting that Schiff was facing federal scrutiny regarding residency declarations made to 2 separate government entities, a property in Maryland and a property in California, both legally designated as primary residence in documents filed simultaneously. One designation had secured a favorable mortgage rate, the other had secured a tax exemption. The same individual's signature appeared on both, the same calendar year. Vance described this without editorial language. He did not say fraud. He did not say hypocrisy. He simply described what the public record showed and allowed the audience to hold it alongside everything else they had heard in the previous 40 minutes. He said, "You addressed this panel and told the working class people in this audience, the mechanics and the contractors and the people who actually live in one house under one mortgage they actually signed, that they were too susceptible to emotional narrative to parse factual reality." He said, "And the person who told them that is the subject of a federal inquiry into whether he claimed two separate homes as his singular primary residence at the same time, depending on which classification offered the superior financial benefit." The room was completely still. He said, "I am not drawing conclusions. I am not in a position to draw conclusions about an ongoing inquiry. I am simply observing that the evidentiary standard you apply to yourself in financial matters appears to be somewhat different from the evidentiary standard you apply to the citizens you have spent 7 years instructing on the importance of verified facts." A junior staffer appeared at the edge of the stage and moved toward Schiff with the quick, low-shouldered posture of someone delivering information that cannot wait. She leaned toward his ear. She placed a folded note beside his untouched water glass. She retreated. The front rows watched her expression as she left the stage. The specific expression of someone who has just delivered news that changes the remaining calculus of an evening. The note stayed folded on the table. Schiff gathered himself. What he attempted next was genuinely his best remaining argument, and credit belongs to the acknowledgement that it was not entirely without substance. He said he wanted to discuss courage, since the subject had been implicitly present all evening. He said that during a period when a specific executive was attempting to corrupt the federal apparatus to his own purposes, he had stood in the legislative chamber and named it publicly. He said his colleagues had been afraid. He said he had not been afraid. He said they had censured him for it, and he had told them their hostility was a distinction he would accept. He said he would repeat every decision tomorrow. He said that Vance, occupying a position that had been made available to him by the very executive Schiff had resisted, was not in a position to lecture him on the nature of institutional courage. It landed with genuine emotional weight for a moment. In the authenticity of his conviction, there was something real. Whatever else was true, the man believed this part. The room shifted slightly. A journalist who had been writing without pause set the pen flat on the notepad and simply listened. Vance let the silence hold after Schiff finished. He said, "Nobody on this panel is taking your courage away from you, Senator. You held a position under pressure. I will say that without qualification in any venue in this country." He finally unfolded the paper. He smoothed it flat on the table and turned it toward the cameras. It contained Schiff's own words, the specific phrasing from the 2017 appearances placed directly adjacent to a single sentence from the investigation's conclusion. 2 lines. The distance between them was the entire evening's argument, laid flat and visible to anyone with a functioning lens. He said, "Your courage is not on trial tonight. That is not what we are here about." He said, "We are here about one thing. You told the public 200 times that you had seen the evidence. The investigators searched for 2 years and could not find what you saw. You entered an unverified document into the permanent congressional record because it aligned with the narrative you had already sold. Your own party voted to attach the word misled to your name in their permanent record, and when the accounting arrived, when the moment came that is available to any public figure who has overstated their position, you used that moment to tell the country that their credulity was the problem." He said, "I grew up in a part of this country where nobody had the patience for the distinction between saying something that turned out to be wrong and saying something you knew might not hold up. People I grew up with had one word for the difference between those two things, and it was not a gentle word." He said, "I served in a combat zone as a correspondent. The only rule that mattered was that you documented what you actually witnessed, because people at home were going to make decisions based on your reporting. If you filed something you hoped was true, someone was going to act on it. The consequences were real. The accountability was immediate. You could not go back later and tell the people who acted on your reporting that they should have been more skeptical." He looked at Schiff directly. He said, "You told this country that what distinguished you from everyone else was that you only spoke to what you personally saw. That is the standard you set in public. Repeatedly tonight, I asked you to demonstrate it with one piece of evidence." "One?" He placed his hand flat on the paper. He said, "You are not the one on this stage who doesn't understand how truth works." 11 words, delivered at the volume of a conversation. He did not call Schiff a liar. He did not use the word fraud. He did not say anything that required the speaker to have formed a judgment about another man's intentions. He simply placed 2 pieces of text beside each other, a repeated claim, and the official finding that could not substantiate it, and made the observation that the person who had called him ignorant about evidentiary standards was not the one in the room who had failed to produce evidence when asked. Adam Schiff looked at his wrist. He looked at it for the fourth time since the panel began, and the people in the front rows caught it the way you catch a tell in a card game, not looking for it, but recognizing it immediately when it appears. His watch was a reflex, the kind of habit that develops when a person has spent years in rooms where the broadcast timer is the escape route. When the clock ran out, the hard question went unanswered. When the segment ended, the studio moved to commercial. The watch had saved him many times. He unclasped it. He set it on the table beside the document Vance had placed there, beside the unopened note, beside the water glass he had not touched. He moved toward the microphone and opened his mouth. The feedback tone that came through the system was sharp and immediate, a single high-pitched shrill that cut through the room the way a glass breaks in a silent house. Not electronic failure, but proximity, the microphone too close, the posture too urgent, the lean too desperate. He had nothing left to say. The host asked, with professional gentleness, whether the senator wished to offer a response. He did not respond. By the time the room had fully cleared, the clip was already moving. Someone had edited the sequence with minimal intervention, the 200 claims, the request for one piece of evidence, the censure language, the watch, the feedback tone, the silence. They had not added commentary. They had not scored it with music. They had not inserted graphics or lower thirds. They had simply placed the sequence in order and released it. By midnight, it was everywhere. Not because of the argument it contained. The argument had been available in various forms for years, in articles and documentaries and congressional testimonies. It was everywhere because of what it looked like. Because an audience had watched a man who had declared himself the institutional standard bearer of verified truth be asked to verify one piece of it, and had watched him look at his watch instead. The public was not debating the merits of the Russia investigation by midnight. They were watching a loop. A specific, undeniable, irrefutable loop of a single moment playing on every screen they owned. They were finished with the argument. They were past the argument. They were in the place that comes after, the place where a political figure stops being a subject of debate and becomes a subject of observation, a character in a story that has already been decided. In the marble corridor outside the hearing room, a journalist intercepted a Democratic representative who had endorsed Schiff publicly on multiple occasions. The representative agreed to speak without attribution, scanning the hallway before starting. She said, "There were people inside our caucus who understood what had happened years ago. The honest conversation we were having internally was that the public statements had gotten ahead of the confirmable record. We told ourselves it was an enthusiasm problem, a communication style issue. We told ourselves he had access to things we couldn't speak to publicly. We were wrong to let it continue. A politician can survive an overstated claim. What tonight showed is that you cannot survive being asked for one piece of it in front of a live camera and looking at your watch instead." She was gone before the recorder was fully raised. The man from Pennsylvania drove home in silence. He merged onto the highway before 11 o'clock, the dark fields of Maryland passing in the headlights. He did not turn on the radio. He was thinking about a moment that had stayed with him, not the arguments, not the document, not the 11 words. He was thinking about the watch. Somewhere past the state line, something loosened in his chest that had been compressed for 18 months. He did not cry. He simply drove, and somewhere in the silence between exits, he started laughing. He laughed at the watch, at the feedback tone, at the man who had spent 2 years telling the country he had seen the evidence, and who, when finally asked to show one piece of it, reached instinctively for the one thing in the room that might make the time run out faster. He laughed because it was the most human thing he had ever seen happen to a powerful person. Not the lies, if that was what they were. Not the institutional failures or the congressional censure or the federal inquiry. The watch, the instinct, in the moment of final accounting, to reach for the clock. He drove the rest of the way home without speaking. He got into his house, and he went to sleep, and for the first time in a year and a half, he slept through the night. Vance left without lingering. No press availability, no post-panel interviews. He folded the document back along its original crease, returned it to his jacket, exchanged brief handshakes with the other panelists, including the Democratic prosecutor who had spoken once and returned to silence, and walked through the side exit. He passed Schiff's empty chair. The watch was still on the table. The unopened note was still beside it. The water glass had not been touched. He had arrived with one piece of paper. He left with it in his pocket. He had not needed anything else. The final thing worth noting is this. The crowd in Dirksen G50 that evening had come expecting a confrontation. They had anticipated the standard format, aggressive claims, defensive counters, the usual performance of opposition that political events of this kind reliably produce. Both sides of the room expecting their representative to win, the middle wondering which way it would go. They did not get a confrontation. They got something quieter and more permanent. They got a man with one piece of paper asking another man with 200 public claims to show him just one. And when the man with 200 claims could not produce the one that was requested, the audience did not cheer. They went quiet, and in that quiet, which lasted long enough to matter, the political legacy of a decade of performance collapsed not under the weight of an attack, but under the weight of a single, simple, unanswerable question. The kind that was obvious the whole time. The kind that someone finally just asked,